Head nurse Eliza began her night shift as the echo of footsteps reverberated through the hospital corridors. St. Augustine Hospital was always unsettling at night. Flickering fluorescent lights, the monotonous hum of medical equipment, and the eerie stillness of the long, empty halls. Everything had been proceeding as usual until something strange happened in room 406. The patient, Martin Graves, was 54 years old. He had been hospitalized after a severe car accident and spent weeks in the ICU. His condition had recently stabilized. During her routine check at 2 a.m., Eliza found Martin awake, lying in his bed, staring blankly at the ceiling. His IV was intact and his vitals were stable. When she asked if he was feeling all right, Martin whispered in a hoarse voice, "They're here." Eliza offered a reassuring smile, assuming he was hallucinating, a common symptom in trauma patients. "It's just me here, Martin. Try to get some rest," she said before leaving the room. But when the morning shift arrived, Martin's bed was empty. A cold dread settled in Eliza's chest as the realization hit her. Security was called immediately. The first step was to check the hospital's surveillance footage. Throughout the night, no doors had been opened, no exits had been used. Martin leaving the hospital on his own was impossible. He was too weak to even stand unassisted. But the most disturbing discovery was that the security footage from inside his room was missing. Dr. Calloway, the hospital's chief physician, tried to remain rational. Either someone took him out, or... He didn't finish his sentence, but the weight of the unsaid words lingered. Every staff member was questioned, yet no one had seen Martin leave. His room had been locked, the windows sealed shut, and even his IV stand remained untouched. Only Martin himself had disappeared. Eliza, desperate for answers, returned to room 406. That's when she noticed something chilling, deep scratches on the bedside rail, as if someone had been clinging to it in sheer desperation. The paint on the walls was slightly scraped, as if nails had raked against it. A sickening feeling crept into her stomach. That night, an elderly nurse, who had worked at the hospital for decades, whispered to Eliza, "Room 406. Patients have gone missing from that room before, and none of them were ever found." Eliza wanted to dismiss it as superstition, but doubt gnawed at her mind. Later that night, during her shift, she heard the soft sound of bare feet padding down the hallway. A cold shiver ran down her spine. The footsteps stopped right outside room 406, followed by complete silence. Slowly, she peeked inside. The bed's sheets were slightly indented, as if someone unseen was lying there. Heart pounding, she stepped back and shut the door. She squeezed her eyes shut and took a deep breath. Something was very wrong with this hospital, but no one dared to acknowledge it. By morning, she had already written her resignation letter. Before leaving, she decided to watch the surveillance footage one last time. At exactly 3:14 a.m., the camera outside room 406 flickered with static. For 2 brief seconds, a blurry image appeared. Martin, sitting upright in his bed, staring directly into the camera. David was an experienced technician who often worked late nights at the hospital. He was used to wandering the empty corridors, but tonight felt different. He had gone down to the basement to check a malfunctioning elevator. After finishing his task, he pressed the button to return, but instead of heading up, the elevator moved to the wrong floor, an old, unused section of the hospital. When the doors slid open, he found himself staring into a forgotten wing, dark, musty, and eerily silent. A strange unease crept over him, but curiosity got the better of him. The dim lights flickered as he stepped into the corridor. Dusty signs, rusted stretchers, and broken furniture were scattered around. As he moved forward, his eyes caught an old staff room sign on a door slightly ajar. Inside, he found what appeared to be an abandoned archive, desks, broken chairs, and rows of filing cabinets, their surfaces thick with dust. David started flipping through the files. They contained records of former hospital employees, complete with names, photos, and even old ID cards. As he skimmed through them, some of the names felt strangely familiar. One, in particular, made his breath hitch: Lisa Whitmore. His mother had once mentioned a nurse by that name, a woman who had mysteriously vanished decades ago. David's pulse quickened. His hands trembled as he checked more files. They all belonged to employees from the same time period, nurses who had supposedly resigned and left. But these records told a different story. The hospital had never closed their cases. It was as if their disappearances had been erased from public knowledge, but not from this room. Then, a whisper. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but there was no draft. The sound came from inside the room, an indistinct murmur that sent a chill down his spine. Spinning around, he caught a glimpse of movement in the corner. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. He knew he shouldn't be here. Slamming the files shut, he turned to leave, but the door creaked and slowly swung closed on its own. Panic surged through him. He grabbed the handle, pulling hard, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew heavy, pressing against his chest. A presence loomed behind him, close enough that he could feel its breath on his neck. He was too terrified to turn around, but his eyes flicked to the reflection in a shattered cabinet mirror. And there they were. Figures in pale white uniforms, their hollow eyes fixed on him. The missing nurses. They had never left. David's mind went blank with terror. He was paralyzed, caught in a nightmarish limbo where time had no meaning. The whispers grew louder, and suddenly, he understood them. They weren't trying to harm him. They were pleading for help. They were trapped. Summoning every ounce of strength, he hurled himself against the door. It burst open, and he stumbled into the hallway. Gasping for breath, he sprinted to the elevator, jabbing the button frantically. As the doors slid shut, he dared one last glance down the corridor. The nurses stood there, watching, their forms flickering like dying candlelight. That night, David left the hospital shaken to his core. The next day, he returned to investigate, but the management insisted that no such floor had ever existed. When he checked the hospital's official records, there was no trace of the files he had seen. But David knew the truth. That floor was real, and someone, was still waiting there. Lisa was an experienced night shift nurse. For years, she had walked the dim hospital corridors, responded to emergencies, and worked on the thin line between life and death. That night started like any other. It was past midnight. Patients were asleep, and the only sounds in the corridors were the rhythmic beeps of monitors. She lowered her head for a moment to rest her tired eyes when the sudden shrill ring of the old desk phone shattered the silence. Lisa flinched. It wasn't unusual for the phone to ring, but an unsettling feeling crept up her spine. She picked up the receiver and answered as usual. "Night shift nurse, how can I help you?" The voice on the other end was barely above a whisper, weak yet disturbingly clear. "Please, get me out of here. It's cold. So cold." Lisa felt a chill crawl over her skin. She glanced at the call records on the computer. The call had come from room 304, but that was impossible. Room 304 had been shut down years ago and was no longer in use. Lisa took a deep breath. It was probably a mistake, maybe even a prank. But the uneasiness in her chest wouldn't fade. How was the phone working if the line had been disconnected? With growing concern, she accessed the hospital's security cameras to check room 304. The screen showed an empty, abandoned room. Her anxiety deepened. Searching the call history, she saw something even stranger. There had been no record of any calls from that room in the past 5 years. Curiosity won over fear, and Lisa made her way down the dimly lit corridor. The sound of her shoes against the cold floor echoed eerily in the silence. When she reached the door, she noticed it was slightly ajar. A cold draft seeped through the gap, sending a shiver down her spine. Swallowing her nerves, she slowly pushed the door open. The room looked as if it hadn't been used in years. The bed remained in the corner, its sheets old and covered in dust. In the far corner stood an outdated telephone, coated in grime. Lisa hesitantly picked up the receiver, her hands trembling. The line was dead. As she placed the phone back, her eyes caught a stack of patient files on a rusted metal shelf. One of the folders had a name scribbled in fading ink: Daniel Carter. Lisa recognized the name. He was listed as a missing patient in the hospital's records. 10 years ago, a young man had mysteriously vanished overnight. His room had been locked, and security footage showed no sign of him leaving. No one had ever seen him again. Heart pounding, Lisa flipped through the files. A yellowed piece of paper slipped out. A note, written in shaky handwriting, read, "Don't forget me. I'm still here." Lisa's breath hitched. A sudden gust of air rushed through the room, slamming the door shut with a deafening bang. The lights flickered, then went out completely. From the darkness, the sound of breathing emerged through the silence. Then, the whisper returned, clearer than before. "It's cold. So cold." Lisa's pulse pounded in her ears. Her vision adjusted to the dark, and that's when she saw it. A shadowed figure standing in the farthest corner of the room. As it stepped closer, she could make out the details of its face. Daniel Carter. Lisa lunged for the door, but it wouldn't budge. Behind her, the phone rang again. Frozen in fear, she hesitated before slowly picking up the receiver. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Daniel, what do you want?" The whisper answered, this time steady, almost pleading. "Don't leave me. I've been here too long." Lisa squeezed her eyes shut and threw herself against the door, pushing with all her strength. Suddenly, the door gave way, and she stumbled into the hallway. Panting heavily, she turned to look back. The room was silent again, the cold air dissipating. Trembling, she called security. But when they arrived and searched the room, they found nothing. No files, no phone, just an empty, abandoned space. The next day, Lisa checked the hospital records again, hoping to make sense of what had happened. When she looked at the date of Daniel Carter's disappearance, her stomach dropped. It was exactly 10 years ago to the day. A few days later, she filed her resignation. But every night before she fell asleep, she still heard that whisper in the back of her mind. "It's cold. So cold."